Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're tackling something every healthcare provider is going to face at some point, the highly sensitive, intensely personal, and legally complex world of reproductive health. We're talking about that really delicate balancing act between strict legal frameworks, ethical pillars, and what patient-centered care actually looks like on the ground. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The 4 pillars of ethics. 2. Rules of informed consent. 3. Navigating conscientious objections. 4. Minors and reproductive health. And finally, number 5, safeguarding and cultural practices. All right, let's jump right in. Section 1, the 4 pillars of ethics, the core of bioethics. So these are the 4 prima facie principles, popularized by Beauchamp and Childress, that really act as the engine for moral reasoning in healthcare. You've got beneficence, which is your duty to help and act in the patient's best interest, autonomy, honoring their right to choose, non-maleficence, the absolute duty to do no harm, and justice, making sure care is fair. Now, what's fascinating here is that this is a totally dynamic balancing act. There's no single principle that automatically trumps the others in clinical practice. Instead, they give us the framework to hash out the absolute best outcome for the patient. But let's zoom in on autonomy for a second. Self-determination is the absolute driving force behind pretty much all the complexities we're about to explore today. It stands in direct contrast to medical paternalism. You know, that old school idea that the doctor always knows best. Today, even if you are acting entirely in the patient's physical best interests, you literally have no right to override the wishes of a competent patient. Section 2. Rules of informed consent. More than just a signature. 1914. Can you believe that? It's honestly incredible to think this landmark ruling happened over a century ago. It established the strict legal precedent that informed consent is an ongoing protection of bodily autonomy, basically self-sovereignty. This was the exact moment medicine firmly pivoted away from paternalism, cementing the fact that patients absolutely must actively agree to what happens to their own bodies. So the huge takeaway here is that consent is a structured communication process. It is not just hurriedly checking boxes on a clipboard while walking out the door. The guidelines demand these specific steps: disclosing the nature of the procedure, explaining the potential risks and benefits, offering reasonable alternatives, and, this is the big one, assessing whether the patient actually understood what you just told them. Because here's the reality. A consent form is merely evidence that a discussion took place. Written consent is actually legally required for only a very small number of specific treatments, like fertility treatments or sterilization. So while documenting the chat is highly advised for invasive procedures, the paper form itself isn't some magic shield. True comprehension is the entire goal. A signature is legally meaningless if the patient didn't actually grasp the risks. Section 3. Navigating conscientious objections, when beliefs clash. So what happens when a doctor's personal beliefs clash with these pillars of care? Well, looking impartially at the British Medical Association guidelines, doctors are absolutely entitled to hold personal values. A conscientious objection happens when a provider doesn't want to participate in a legal, clinically appropriate treatment because it deeply conflicts with their sincere moral beliefs. But as we'll see, there are incredibly strict boundaries here. On one hand, doctors in the UK have statutory rights to opt out of the direct administration of things like abortion or fertility treatments. But on the other hand, the legal limitations are rigid. You absolutely cannot discriminate based on characteristics like gender, race, or sexual orientation. You cannot impede emergency care. If it's an emergency, you step up and provide the care. You also can't refuse pre- and post-treatment management. And you have a strict duty to inform patients of alternatives so their care is never delayed. Section 4, Minors and Reproductive Health, Stress Testing the Rules. We're going to stress test these rules now with a really heavy question that comes up a lot and causes a ton of anxiety in clinical practice. Can a 16 or 17-year-old legally consent to an abortion or contraception? Well, the law actually provides a very structured, definitive answer. And this brilliantly illustrates the codified rules. In England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, all young people aged 16 and over are legally presumed to have the capacity to give consent. Think about that. It is never the burden of the 16 or 17-year-old to prove they're capable. A young person with capacity can validly consent to abortion, contraception, or treatment for an STI entirely on their own. But wait, what if you doubt their capacity? You can't just immediately say they lack it. First, you have to actively attempt to enhance it. You've got to remove barriers to their understanding, address their pain first, wait if they're super fatigued or heavily medicated. Make sure you're explaining things plainly.
The ultimate goal is always empowering the young person to participate in their own choices as much as humanly possible. And of course, document that assessment carefully.
And the courts are crystal clear on this next point. A parent's refusal cannot veto the valid consent of a capable 16 or 17-year-old seeking an abortion or contraception. Now, if the minor truly does lack capacity, a proxy, like someone with parental responsibility, can legally consent, but only if it's undeniably in the patient's best interests. And a quick side note here, if a minor lacks the capacity to consent to contraception, you really have to question if they even have the capacity to consent to sexual activity in the first place. That immediately triggers vital safeguarding protocols.
Section 5. Safeguarding and Cultural Practices. For our final section, let's look at how the courts establish a very stark legal and ethical boundary between two specific cultural procedures involving physical alterations to minors. This boundary relies heavily on those early pillars we talked about, doing no harm and determining the absolute best interests of the child.
Let's look at non-therapeutic male circumcision first. It is legal, but it demands a rigorous assessment. Because it's an irreversible procedure, doctors have to ask parents to really justify the request, carefully weighing cultural benefits against medical risks. Ideally, it requires valid consent from both parents with parental responsibility. And this is absolutely crucial. It is never ethically acceptable to perform this on a capable child who refuses it, no matter what the parents want.
Conversely, looking at the BMA guidelines, female genital mutilation is viewed entirely differently under the law. It is universally recognized as a practice causing severe, immediate, and long-term harm to a patient's sexual, reproductive, and psychological health.
FGM is completely illegal across England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. Furthermore, there is a mandatory statutory duty to notify the police if a healthcare professional observes it or is informed of it in a patient under 18. Urgent safeguarding action must be taken to protect the child's bodily integrity. This is a very clear legal boundary where the state firmly and automatically overrides any cultural or parental request to prevent profound harm.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to reflect on this entire balancing act. From the high-level pillars of beneficence down to the granular legalities of minor consent and conscientious objection, the core of all of this remains the patient. When rigid legal frameworks, ethical pillars, and deeply held personal beliefs collide, how will you ensure that true, informed patient autonomy remains your absolute ultimate priority? Think about that. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.